Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, and raurangatira mā, no mai hari mai, whakatau mai, ki tēnei hui mariko. Ka beri kotaho ko te karahi o te patea whaiwhakaro. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, tihe Māori ora. Very warm welcome to you all. I'm Barry Coates, founder and CEO of Mindful Money. This is the first seminar in our third seminar series. These will, as opposed to previous series, be held on Wednesdays at 12 midday each fortnight. And we're going to kick off with climate change. There is no more important issue for us to start on than the climate crisis. So we all know the reporting of fires, droughts, floods, and cyclones. Just as an example, this year Pakistan suffered floods that submerged 1/3 of the country and displaced more than 30 million people. But this is only one of the tragedies that is happening around the world. And the more it happens, sadly, the less we're able to hear. These impacts fall hardest on those who are the most vulnerable in the poorest countries, as I kind of know all well from my time as a decade as head of Oxfam New Zealand. And the injustice is that these communities, these countries have contributed the least to the climate crisis. This is climate injustice on steroids. So the toll also isn't, of course, just on humans, but on nature itself. Over the past decades, climate change has contributed to a loss of more than 70% in global wildlife populations, according to the Living Planet Index. So we've also seen the impacts in New Zealand. As we all know, there have been floods and storms that, of course, suffering an economic hardship, and there are warnings that some properties in coastal zones and floodplains will become uninsurable in future. So the impacts of climate change are increasing and are becoming unavoidable. But the thing is that these impacts are at 1.1 degrees of global temperature rise. And emissions are still going up. World leaders meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for the COP27 summit have been given evidence that temperatures are projected to rise by more than a doubling to 2.4 degrees. And that's if all goes well. We're running out of time. COP27 is an opportunity that must not be missed. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres told delegates at COP27, humanity has a choice, cooperate or perish. That's putting it very starkly. So tonight we've assembled reports from key people who are at COP27. They have different perspectives, and we'll show their videos, comment on those videos, invite your questions, and your feedback. I'm really thrilled to be joined in this discussion by Olivia Wannon. Olivia's a climate reporter at the Forever Project for Stuff. She's an investigative writer, ecologist, and a really informed voice on climate change. So a very warm welcome to you, Olivia.
Kia ora, everyone.
Great, there you are. Fantastic.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So Olivia, you were at COP26 last year. And at that stage, there was just so much hype around the conference in Glasgow. Obviously, the world was watching. But this year, it seems different. Feels like our expectations have been progressively lowered, despite the climate emergency being far worse than a year ago. Why do you think this is?
Some of that is natural, I think, because there's just less on the agenda. There was so much leftover work from previous COPs that needed to be done last year, that it really was a kind of if we can't get this done, can we actually make the Paris Agreement work? So there was huge interest in getting that done. There was also just the fact that it was being hosted by the UK, who had huge diplomatic force and could hype this up. So luckily, a lot of that work did get done. It wasn't an entirely successful conference, as I'm sure we can talk about. But this one, I think there are some important things on the agenda, as we'll talk about, but it's not as crucial to the survival of the Paris Agreement, in my opinion.
Interesting. It's also important that there isn't any backsliding on some of those commitments made at Glasgow, and particularly around fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really tough year. We have to remember that even though the last COP came when the pandemic was still happening and Omicron was out there, you know, we didn't have the invasion of Ukraine. We didn't have this huge inflationary crisis, and we didn't have, obviously, the energy crisis in Europe that's led it to cut off Russian oil and go seeking fossil fuels elsewhere. So I think that has maybe taken, you know, put a dampener on things, and things just are tougher than 12 months later.
Okay, so let's start with reports with a call to action on a video from Gabrielle Po-Ching, who's from the Pacific Climate Warriors.
Talofa lava everyone, olo uingo o Gabrielle Titihuia Po-Ching. He uria hau no te whanua apanui, no te aitanga amaki, no tuhoi, no Ngati Hamo ki loto pārawa ko Wawau Hoki. I am a Pacific Climate Warrior within the Te Whanganui Tara team. Over the weekend, my home island of Samoa celebrated a joyous and momentous occasion as we made history by winning against England in the Rugby League semi-finals, cementing our journey into the final. Whilst our people celebrated across the world, our joy is marred knowing the threat that is the climate crisis. Pacific leaders are at COP27 calling on the world to act with the urgency needed to fight the climate crisis and as such save the Pacific and save the world. New Zealand has a major role to play on behalf of its Pacific neighbours. With fossil fuel lobbyists outnumbering almost every nation's delegation, the Pacific needs New Zealand to step up and demonstrate the climate leadership it so claims. While the New Zealand government's recent announcement of a dedicated allocation of $20 million to address loss and damage in developing countries is welcome, it is not explicitly earmarked for the Pacific, where the finance is most needed and is not new funding. The lives and livelihoods of Pacific peoples continue to suffer irreparable damage caused by a climate crisis that we've contributed the least to. As a global North country, New Zealand has a responsibility to ensure that loss and damage funding is not only sufficient, but is also accessible to the communities that need it most. This means New Zealand must actively push for loss and damage to be a standing item in all climate conversations. The Kiowa Declaration presented by Pacific Islanders at COP27 on 8th November clearly demands urgent and decisive action on mitigation and adaptation, new and additional finance for loss and damage, and the creation of more equitable finance arrangements. We need to ensure a just transition for peoples on the front line of climate change. Governments must commit to the $100 billion pledges made for climate finance, but also ensure there is new and additional finance for loss and damages. Private financial institutions must not invest in any more fossil fuel and should shift the flow of money from destructive, extractive industries into a just and equitable transition. One such mechanism to supporting a just transition is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Pacific continues to lead the way in fighting the climate crisis, with Vanuatu and Tuvalu recently endorsing the treaty. New Zealand has offered in principle to support the treaty. The next step is action, and we call upon New Zealand to endorse the treaty. At COP27, New Zealand should front the climate conversations where Pacific voices are not present. They should ensure loss and damage is a standing item across all negotiations, including the climate finance that is needed to address this climate crisis. Whawhitai te le lava.
Hello and whawhatai lava to Gabrielle for that call to action. I think that's really helpful, and we'll come back to those themes in discussion, Olivia, after we dive into the negotiations, if that's okay. We've asked Rod Oram to give us an overview of the key issues in the negotiations. Here is what I think is really interesting and insightful video interview with Rod Oram. It's my great pleasure to welcome Rod Oram to the seminar, beaming in from Sharm el-Sheikh. Very warm welcome to you, Rod. Thank you very much for making this time available in your busy schedule.
Well, thank you, Barry. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. And I'm very keen to have a chat about COP27.
Fantastic. As you all, I'm sure, know, Rod is a business journalist currently writing for Newsroom. He's also a researcher, speaker, and hugely respected thought leader on climate change and business sustainability. Now, Rod, can you set the scene for us? So COP27 is being held in the Middle East, the center of oil and gas production. And you've written over some great articles over recent days about the huge number of fossil fuel lobbyists at COP27. Do you see signs of backtracking on the pledges made last year at COP26 on transitioning away from fossil fuels?
Not so much backtracking, but just ever more intense pressure from the fossil fuel industry. So a very, very key test at the end of this week is whether the language in Glasgow about a phasing down of coal gets modified in some way, hopefully gets modified on the upside, so it's a phasing down of fossil fuels. But it could theoretically go the other way, which would be to remove such language at all. It's indeed very palpable that the effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and international oil prices, there's this extraordinary crazy dash for gas, and all sorts of reports, not the least of which by Climate Action Tracker last week, that shows that that is a massive overinvestment and would end up being grandfathered assets that would keep producing emissions for a very long time. And so it's this intense, ever more intense pressure here, the fight between renewable energy and fossil fuels. And this is literally the first COP in which fossil fuel industries have been invited to be participants in the program. So they're actually on the program. And the big line they keep selling is that gas is a transition energy source. And we should be doing lots of that. And indeed, just before COP started, Egypt agreed a gas supply agreement from here up to Europe in exchange for being able to close down some coal-fired power stations with a view of building gas-fired power stations here in Egypt. And there's something like 55 oil companies, domestic and international, exploring in Egypt. So these are the sorts of very intense pressures. And I think the best way to respond in overall as a global community is to really get the finance together, to really push renewable energy very, very hard and just push fossil fuels out of the picture altogether. Because economically that makes sense, but we just need to have the finance there, particularly for developing countries that are desperately trying to leapfrog over fossil fuels the way they leapfrogged over landlines and went straight to mobiles. And so I think that, yes, we have to fight the fossil fuel sector all the way, but by far the best action is to get the money together to really invest heavily in renewables.
That's fascinating, Rod, and the dash for gas really is contrary to the advice from the International Energy Agency that said we really don't need new oil and gas field development in future. So I guess that's one for us to be watching over the next week.
Yeah, in fact, the IEA went even far more direct than that there can be no more investment in new fossil fuel development, just to use existing resources would be more than ample to meet any declining need in fossil fuels. So this massive new investment is very destabilizing. And the nations of the world have got, and the societies of the world have got to find ways to really push back incredibly vigorously, particularly because COP28 next year is going to be hosted by the UAE. And so that's going to be the most overt hosting of COP by an oil and gas nation. Egypt is in part, but UAE is big time. And so we could only expect the sort of politics dynamics at work here to be even stronger next year in the UAE at COP28.
Rod, moving to the issue of international carbon credits, it's obviously a mechanism that the government is relying on heavily in order to meet New Zealand's climate change targets. However, the negotiations on this are not yet complete. Can you talk us through some of the issues that are being discussed and how things are going in those negotiations? Obviously, there've been concern about bribery and corruption and trading of hot air under the Kyoto Protocol. Do now negotiations point towards a more robust and a greater degree of integrity in the system?
There are some important steps along the way. So, for example, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, earlier this year convened a high-level experts group to deliver a report and very strong guidelines on greenwashing. And in fact, Dr. Rod Carr, the chair of our Climate Change Commission, was one of the authors of that. That was released at the beginning of COP last week. It's a very good document and very good guidelines. And so that's a small step to try to get more discipline into this. But in contrast, I call him Secretary of State, he no longer is, John Kerry of the US, now Biden's climate ambassador, launched a new carbon markets initiative last week. But there was a surprising amount of pushback against it because of all of those fears. And I think a growing understanding, at least for people who are really locked into the climate science, that we've actually got to be reducing emissions, not just trying to offset them. So yes, to support forests in various parts of the world, but forests that can pull down existing emissions in the air, not absorb new ones going in. So that's the great dilemma. And certainly, as we know, New Zealand is a real outlier in terms of how big a proportion of our carbon budgets we plan to meet by overseas purchases. And the only country that comes into our league is Switzerland, which is already very active. But Switzerland is far more advanced in this process than we are. So they have a number of bilateral relationships with such countries. I think there's about 6 of them, where they have worked through very strictly how that investment in those countries, in order for Switzerland to gain the credits, worked through. So we've got a huge amount of work to do in New Zealand to get to that stage. And I'm just not familiar with how much of that is going on in our government at this time. But it still gets away from that fundamental issue that we need to do 2 things. We need to reduce emissions in our own economies for the sake of our economies and for the sake of modernizing our economies and transforming them to climate compatible economies. But at the same time, we need to find money to help developed countries do the same. But let them claim the credits for that, not for us to pick them up. And that's why I think that this is a deeply flawed proposition that we are a real outlier on in New Zealand. And I hope that the pressure on us to change that policy is going to become a good deal more, the pressure is going to mount on that, I hope, internationally.
Right. Rod, you've obviously spent a lot of time looking at agriculture, both in New Zealand and in the international negotiations. Are you seeing interesting things emerge from the negotiations and the discussion forums around COP27?
Agriculture is very big and in very many places, not so much in the Paris Agreement itself, but in all the implementation work. And I don't keep track of all the negotiations because they are very complex, very multitudinous, and I'm waiting to see where they land. I've been spending my time mostly amongst business and civil society and NGOs and research institutes and the like, to see what's going on in the agricultural space. And one of the themes that was strong at Glasgow, but I feel is weaker here, is the idea that nature-based solutions to climate deliver a greater agricultural resilience, but also greater biodiversity and greater resilience to climate change and all the rest. That was a very strong message in Glasgow, and I feel it's getting rather muddied here. So what we're seeing, for example, on the corporate front is a large number of groups or of agribusinesses or agribusinesses working with research institutes or individual agribusinesses have come out with all kinds of climate plans, and some of them look very credible. I'm reluctant to name names, but Nestle and Unilever might be two of those. I was sitting in a session in which there was a very senior person from Unilever and Danone and Nestle last week, and they were saying obvious things about how they're going to help farmers in developing countries improve their farming, and they're investing heavily in regenerative agriculture to help that climate resilience and all of those things. And I believe that's genuine. What's very difficult to assess is how much impact it's having. And indeed, they are clear and honest that they're still working at sort of a project level basis, both in developed and developing countries, rather than it becoming deeply systemic in their businesses. Now, of course, becoming deeply systemic takes time. It's a journey, and at least they're on it. But I still think that for many areas of agriculture, there is still a sense that the world needs food, and therefore we have to be very cautious about how we change food systems. And the best example of that is the global dairy industry. I went to their presentation, Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. They don't even define what net zero means, and they have no overt goals about how much reduction even in emissions intensity in dairy, let alone in absolute emissions reduction. So again, you know, the politest thing you could say about them, that they are well-intentioned programs involving lots of organizations and governments and dairy companies and all the rest. But it's far from, it is completely clear that they're actually making no real progress. They're still in a kind of a setup phase. And the overall thing about agriculture here is that Saturday was Agriculture and Adaptation Day, the first time that agriculture had been designated a theme of the day at COP. And yet New Zealand was stunningly conspicuous by its absence from any of those programs. And I found that deeply, deeply disappointing. And an example of how isolated our New Zealand agriculture is on these issues. I just don't think by and large, with one or few honourable exceptions, leaders and on down in the sector are just not plugged in to how fundamentally land use change, farming and food and the whole food systems are changing, have to change in order to be able to respond to the climate crisis. So I think we're living in cloud cuckoo land in New Zealand on this one.
Not the first time you've said that, actually, Rod. So I'm sure it's...
My judgment, I've amassed more evidence. My judgment is even stronger and more confirmed.
Exactly. Thank you, and good luck for the next week, where suddenly the ministers arrive and the stakes rise. So good luck, and thank you for your reporting, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing an optimistic result on this.
Thanks. Matua.
So I thought that was a really interesting interview, and Rod is always great for having some really good insights. What struck you about those issues, Olivia?
The absence of of New Zealand at the dairy or the agricultural stuff is very interesting. I suppose the focus is on what's happening at home on a certain policy, and maybe they're missing that global picture. Everything he said was really, really interesting. What's going to happen on the global pledge to phase down unabated coal and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, whether that could get stronger or weaker, is something I'm paying a lot of attention to.
I note you've also written about the early discussions on setting 2025 as the peaking year for emissions, and that all countries should be signing up to make sure that their emissions are in decline after 2025.
Yeah, so that struck me when I was listening to our climate ambassador, Kay Harrison, talk about what she'd learned at the pre-COP events that have been held through the year, and that some people had been talking about a similar goal, similar to phasing down coal, would be to peak emissions by a certain year. She mentioned 2025. What is so interesting to me is that the International Energy Agency says that, courtesy of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the world may actually be on track to achieve that anyway, which is a great start. So there would be questions, if that did get put down, there would be questions as to whether that would actually be an ambitious goal. To be honest, phasing down coal and phasing out fossil fuels actually would be arguably the tougher ask, because obviously that would need to start straight away.
Yeah. Rod said something that as Mindful Money we can absolutely identify with, which is the problem isn't necessarily the economic case for investing in renewables and replacing renewable supply over oil and gas and coal, but actually the financing structures that are going to accelerate that process. And particularly as many of the financiers are still stuck in financing the infrastructure that's already there. And as money starts to shift, that infrastructure for fossil fuels will rapidly become worthless. So is that a sort of analysis that you agree with?
I think what's so interesting is I remember reading something that installing new solar panels is cheaper than even funding a currently running coal power plant. So the economics are definitely shifting. I understand that, that's tough for developing countries and that sometimes the equations are different. But what has been so interesting at this COP and the last COP is that there's this kind of model coming out where richer countries will pledge billions of dollars to help one particular country. We've had South Africa last year and then Indonesia this year. And these are huge amounts of finance, billions of dollars, in order to make that shift, to shut down those coal power plants. And it seems like those programs, they take a while and, maybe they don't seem amazingly exciting, but they maybe do, signal a way forward. And, maybe once one or two of these come up, we'll see them grow in pace in future.
It's good. And so that's the kind of leapfrog that you've seen also in communications, where developing countries don't have landlines, they go straight to mobile. And the ability for them to meet the energy needs of their people by going straight to renewable energy requires that level of finance, which makes it disappointing that the funds haven't been flowing yet. But as you say, maybe there are signs that that's now starting to really gear up. But that's, as you say, that's a crucial mechanism.
Yeah, and I hope that maybe developing countries might be more open to the message that actually fossil fuels, it's not just about the actual running costs, but they impose, health costs and productivity costs. When we pump this stuff into the environment, we're hurting people. China knows that. I believe the health costs alone mean that, and productivity costs of those horrible, foggy, polluted days, mean that actually making the transition makes a lot of economic sense. So I hope that message might be winning people over more. Developing companies can do things better.
Cool. Absolutely right. And let's crack on. So we have a report coming up from a video report from Rhiannon Mackie, and Rhiannon is I'll introduce her on video, but great to have a voice of a young activist.
Kia ora, Rhiannon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Kia ora. Thank you for having me on.
I'm talking with Rhiannon Mackie. Rhiannon is already a seasoned campaigner at 18 years old, having been a leader in the school strikes movement. She's a passionate speaker on the urgency of climate action. She's a representative for New Zealand Climate Action Network at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where she's coming from now. So we've had excuses for the technology, which is always a logistical nightmare at these events. So that's why you're just seeing a photograph of Rhiannon. Rhiannon, thanks again for joining. Can we talk about money? So New Zealand has promised 20 million for loss and damage, essentially compensation, although it's not always called that, to help the Pacific and other developing countries deal with climate impacts. It's not new money, comes from existing budget, but has it helped unblock the standoff over climate finance?
Well, that's a good question. So in reality, this money has not unblocked the standoff over climate finance. Rather, it's being used, I guess, New Zealand seems to be using it to signal to others that it cares about the issue, but at the same time will not take a strong stance in support of, for example, a finance facility at this COP, which is a really strong stance that the G77 in China, the Africa group have both taken in these spaces. And so we're seeing a continuation of the standoff with developed countries in particular, New Zealand, United States, the United Kingdom, coming out against establishing, a loss and damage finance facility at this COP. And New Zealand trying to use this money to placate the developing countries, just to signal that they care, but that virtue signaling isn't supporting further negotiations. In fact, it is continuing to block them from proceeding.
So essentially kind of making a signal, but not enough of a signal to really accelerate the negotiations.
Yeah. And with that said, we are seeing a switch from people talking about if we establish a finance facility to when we establish a finance facility, but at the same time, that negotiation is still a standoff. We're not going to see strong movement from the G77 in China and the Africa group to just accept that we're not going to establish something here. We have, developed countries signaling that they don't want to see anything established at all. But for the most part, it's a conversation of, does it happen now or does it happen in 2024 when this agenda item is mandated to end?
This issue of climate finance has been an absolute blocker for the negotiations for ages. Can we just kind of shift to a sort of a general impression? This is your first conference of the parties you've been to. What's it been like for you as a civil society representative, a young person and a campaigner?
It's been a weird mix of, joy and despair and such an emotional, roller coaster, because on the one hand, we're seeing, delaying tactics from countries that are least affected by the climate crisis. We're seeing a refusal to accept accountability. We're seeing fossil fuel companies platformed by the Egyptian presidency. In not just 3 different events on one day on Friday, we are seeing, like this, expectation that fossil gas is going to continue being something that is present in our societies for an extended period of time. It attempts to establish fossil gas as the transition fuel on a global scale. And it is, that is heartbreaking to see this kind of continual refusal to act with the urgency that we need. But at the same time, there is so much resistance and there is so much willingness to fight amongst our civil society, and so much hope in that, in the refusal to give in and the willingness to keep going.
It's great, Rhiannon, and lovely that you're able to draw hope from the civil society action around these negotiations. We all need hope from these kind of really difficult international processes. So more power to you as you head into the second week, and thanks very much for your reporting from Sharm el-Sheikh. So thank you.
Thank you.
So it's great to see the voice of civil society still holding governments to account despite all the constraints imposed by and the restrictions by the Egyptian government. But I wanted to pick up on one thing that's happened subsequent to Rhiannon's report, is that New Zealand was awarded this thing called the Fossil of the Day. And this is not a good thing to win, because it's about the country that has been most obstructive in blocking progress in the negotiations. Do you want to comment on that? It was kind of obviously for not being supportive enough of the Pacific's position to have an agreement at COP27 as opposed to postponing it till future.
It's a very complicated story, but it's about there's a topic called loss and damage, which has come up. So developed rich countries already give money to developing countries, and that's for cutting their emissions and for adapting to the effects of climate change. But then there's this other area, which we've seen this year, where we've already locked it. We've already got 1.1 degrees of warming. These are, economies are being hit. This damage is being done that no one can adapt to. So the argument from developing countries is, we haven't contributed to this problem. You have, you owe us the finance, or you should help pay for the cleanup bill. And as Rhiannon mentioned, this is, I think the extreme weather this year has really made the case that this is, this argument stands, and there's a moral imperative to help out countries that have already been hit. And New Zealand kind of signalled that it supported that with that $20 million that it announced. But at the same time, we know that the EU and the US are really worried about this, because they obviously have huge historical emissions, and would be the most responsible if it was found that rich countries were liable for the damage, and liability is something that they don't even want to talk about. So we know that the US and the EU, like India and China, can simultaneously say, no, we don't agree with this, and tank an entire COP if they don't agree. So they basically can throw a bit of a diplomatic tantrum, and then nothing will happen. So when we know that that's going to happen, often smaller countries will try to come to a kind of compromise agreement, which includes a bit of movement from the big guys and normally a lot of movement from the smaller players like the Pacific. So I think New Zealand has done this in supporting an idea from the UK that we will make this decision on a central fund to put in this kind of money and distribute it to people in need in 2024. But that does seem to be a kind of conflicting stance after the 20 million. So that's why we got the fossil of the day. It's pretty complicated. I hope I've explained.
Yeah. No, but thanks for that explanation. We've got a couple of questions come in. If it's all right with everyone, we'll run kind of 5 minutes over, but let's deal with these two questions. Thank you, Sebastian Garrick, for your question and your work on climate change and other issues at Otago University. Sebastian asks, investment in renewables being cheaper relies on the levelized cost of the energy, i.e. it's more expensive to install, but far cheaper to operate. And that's heavily influenced by the interest rate. So the question is, do you think the recent increases in interest rates are good or bad for the economics of switching to renewable energy investments? What do you think, Olivia?
It's a great question, and it actually has popped up in coverage. I think developing nations have definitely said that high interest rates are going to be a real issue in getting them to switch, and so offering low interest green loans would be something that they're after. I think there's a great case for that, and I'd love to see more developing countries say, yeah, we acknowledge that this is going to be a problem. What's our role in providing cheaper finance?
And we see a little bit of this happening with New Zealand banks giving sustainability-linked loans that are lower interest rates for solar on houses, etc. So I guess the scale up of that during a time of rising interest rates would be very, very good to have. A second one, Olivia, is one directed to you, and the question is: should media do more to identify climate change as a driver of major disasters? And the question kind of talks about media in Australia saying that the major floods there are entirely due to La Nina and not mentioning climate change at all.
I'd like to think that is changing. I do notice it myself, like if I'm watching, say, Prime News, whenever I hear about a flood, I'm alert to whether it is going to mention climate change. I mean, of course, climate change will never be, it's in many cases of extreme weather, it's a factor. It's hard to know until a couple of weeks after how much of a factor it would be. In our reporting at Stuff, we're really committed to always having something in there. When we can't know for sure because they haven't done the studies yet, we'll include a video that says this is how climate change is making storms worse or making fires worse. So our commitment is to having that on almost every one of our stories. It's not a commitment that we've quite met yet, but we're definitely trying.
Yeah, I'm sure the question wasn't a commentary on the good work that you guys do, but certainly in Australia and the US, it's very frequently the case that climate change is not attributed as a problem at all. Hey, we're going to go to our last video, and this is from Craig Weise. Craig's as you'll hear, an expert in climate finance. So over to Craig.
It's my great pleasure to welcome Craig Weise, joining us from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Craig, welcome.
Barry, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Craig is the CEO of Green Investment and Finance, having steered it through from concept to establishment and recently growth. It's now a fund capitalised at 400 million. And his role is to lead the charge in New Zealand's investment on decarbonisation. So, Craig, New Zealand Green Investment Finance is focused on carbon solutions. Have there been developments in the negotiations over the past week that have moved the agenda forward?
Great question, Barry. Well, I think from the negotiation perspective, this is a really hard call. Last year, there was a lot of commitments, and this year, people are really thinking about execution and how to get capital flows moving globally. And so one of the consequences of that is that the negotiators themselves, who are trying to, I think, reach agreement on something like 77 points, are having a hard time. And so they've been given the task of coming out with some of those decisions or preliminary decisions by tomorrow. And so it's a little early to say. Outside of those negotiations, however, civil society, business, financial institutions, carry on. And that's one of the reasons we're here at COP, to see what those other developments look like. And there certainly have been some interesting things going on.
Anything that really stands out to you, Craig? Any particular game-changing initiatives that you're hearing about?
Yeah, there's some really, really interesting things going on. So one of the things that I'm excited about is seeing what's going to be beyond TCFD. So reporting is one thing, but what you're seeing is global corporate leaders in the climate space coming up with actually climate transition plans. So they're putting out and having their shareholders vote on and approve how their companies are going to actually move to net zero or whatever, sometimes higher standard they're trying to achieve. And that's really, really exciting. And you've seen some of that, and that's been a feature here. Some of the technology developments are also pretty interesting. You're seeing things come through that are actually really, really meaningful solutions, both potentially in steel and in plastics and other areas. And you're also seeing a movement to monetize carbon credits in a way that hasn't been done before. So you're getting some early indicators of the ability to turn those into cash to develop solutions, both in the blue economy and in the natural world that help climate.
Okay. And Craig, last year at COP26, there were massive pledges to go to net zero by the world's biggest financial institutions. This year, the scene's changed a little bit. The UN's just published a report warning of greenwashing. How has that dialogue been affected? Are you seeing kind of now much more drive for implementation of these pledges, or what's happening?
Yeah, look, it's a big, big topic. And I think the whole GFANZ dialogue and the reality that the world continues to finance really high emissions activities is troubling for many. And, you've seen that kind of, I think, bifurcate here in a way that's interesting. So you've got some institutions who are, really grappling with this, because this goes to the core of what they do. It goes to how they look at risk. It goes to their systems and processes and procedures. And, this is the hard stuff. But you do have a lot of people on the ground trying to figure it out, and different ways of perhaps considering how they look at climate risk and how they can actually help that capital flow. But it's tough.
Sounds like, from what you're saying, that you're seeing some cause for optimism as you head into the final week at Sharm el-Sheikh, and as the ministers start to arrive. Are you seeing signs of good progress?
Well, I think, look, this is hard, right? This is the biggest challenge that humankind has ever faced, and it's a challenge we collectively face, and we're all siloed in our countries and in our institutions, in our own, jobs and lives. And so it was never going to be easy. But what you do see is, you see here in particular at COP, a group of people who are really trying to make a difference. And I think off the stages of the political dialogue, when you talk to the institutions and when you talk to leaders actually who are trying to do this stuff, there is a great will to do it. There are still big challenges, and getting capital flows into those places where emissions are growing or economies are coming online from a consumption perspective, and that future path looks carbon intensive, that's the really, really tricky stuff. There are signs of hope in the more developed economies, but it's really about what's going to happen in the rest of the world, and that's going to determine our collective fate. So I'm optimistic. And I think we kind of have to keep working at it, but people need to understand and grasp the depth of the challenge and make real plans, execute on those plans in order to make a difference.
Thank you very much for those insights, Craig, and good luck for the last week, and more power to you.
Cheers. Thanks so much.
So that was a bit of a delve into the world of finance. For those in the audience, we're going to be coming back to the issues of net zero and what investors can do on driving down their emissions at our seminar in 2 weeks' time on the 30th of November. We're going to be joined by Sir Jonathan Porritt and experts from the finance community in the different strategies that can be used in your KiwiSaver account, in your investment account, and overall in the finance sector. So, Olivia, we're a little bit over time. My apologies to the audience, but do you want to give a sort of a final view on how all of this is looking to you as negotiations into the final phase?
I mean, I suppose negotiations are where I expected them to be. I wasn't hugely optimistic that this COP was going to make massive gains for all the reasons we've talked about. But I still think there's an ability to maybe compromise on a couple of things. For all we know, the EU are holding out on loss and damage because they're hoping to push through their preferred wording, which would be a phase out of all fossil fuels. Like, we have to remember that sometimes we trade off things, and the EU might be the least progressive on one issue because it's holding out to be the most progressive on another. I think for the New Zealand audience, I think what we need to remember is that New Zealand is really not on track to meeting our NDC at all. You know, we talk about other countries, you know, being way behind. We really are. We're really not. I'm not confident we're going to be able to meet our first carbon budget. The government's just pulled a major, the biofuels mandate, which was going to help achieve that. And then we've got this huge amount of carbon credits, as someone mentioned before, that we're going to have to buy 101 million tonnes in order to meet our NDC. And we're not even looking for those yet because the Treasury hasn't given the money to allow the Ministry for the Environment to go looking for those. So probably the message I would say is that we need to put pressure on our government to meet its NDC, and for most people to know that we are nowhere near on track for that. Sorry to end on such an unhopeful note.
Well, I'm not sure it's unhelpful at all. You know, I think sort of in an earlier life, I went to quite a few of the earlier COP meetings, and I guess it's easy to not be too hopeful, but also not to be cynical, but just realize that the international framework's vitally necessary, but it's actually not necessarily going to provide us the impetus for real change in the way that has to come from us all, from business, civil society, iwi, individuals. Those are going to be the forces for real change, and in a way that the framework just really backstops some of this. So thank you very much, Olivia. Thanks also to our other contributors, Gabrielle from Pacific Climate Warriors, Rod Oram, Rhiannon Mackey, and Craig Weise, and particularly to you, Olivia. Thank you all. For the audience, you would have noticed these seminars are coming to you midday every second Wednesday. Next one, as I said, on 30th of November, is on net zero and how your investment can be used to drive down climate emissions. This new series isn't possible without generous sponsors, Mercer, New Zealand Green Investment Finance, and Medical Assurance Society, MAS. With thanks also to Booster, Harbour Asset Management, and Trustees Executors. Thanks very much to them for their support of this series. You see them on screen now. So thanks to you all for joining, and we will hope to see you in a couple of weeks and in future. Mate wā.